You learned not to ask, not out of declared pride. You would not call it that. But there is a pattern that settled in over time, silently, without anyone needing to teach it explicitly. When something weighs on you, you manage it internally. When there is difficulty, you resolve it before anyone notices it existed. When the effort is disproportionate, you absorb it without comment. And the sensation that comes afterward is not quite pride. It is something closer to relief, to not having needed to reveal that you were in need. This is not weakness disguised as strength. It is a logic that was built over years of immersion in an environment that treats need as deviation, dependence as deficit, and belonging as a renunciation of individuality. The narrative was everywhere, in the way success is presented, always as a solitary conquest, always as the result of individual will applied against circumstances. In the way stories of overcoming are told, always with the subject alone at the center, never as part of a network that sustained them. In the way asking for help became gradually associated with not having been good enough to not need it. You are here because at some point the weight of isolation became too great to be managed as a personal preference, because the narrative that being alone is strength began to stop matching what you feel. Because there is a distance between what the culture says you should be and what you experience when you are, in fact, alone before something that is not small. This video will not tell you to ask for more help. It will show you why you got here and where the belief that it was inevitable came from. There is a form of exhaustion that does not appear in conventional diagnoses. It is not burnout in the classic sense. Too much work, too little rest. It is something more specific. The exhaustion of carrying alone contradictions that have no individual origin, of managing in silence and continuously pressures that the environment produces but locates in you, of trying to solve problems whose scale is structural with resources that are only personal. And the available response within that experience is usually the same one that deepens the problem. Work more, be more efficient, develop more resilience, strengthen even further the capacity to function without support. The idea that perhaps the problem is not your capacity to endure, but the structure that demands you endure alone. That idea rarely appears as a legitimate option, because the environment that produced the problem also supplied the framing for interpreting it. And that framing is always individual. It is always about you. You are not failing to be strong enough. You are operating within an architecture that was built so that individual strength is the only available category for processing what you feel. Think about how isolation settles in, not dramatically, gradually, almost imperceptibly, through the accumulation of small adjustments. You stop mentioning something that is weighing on you because the moment does not seem right. Then because the situation became more complex and difficult to explain briefly. Then because you have already gone past the point where it would be natural to ask, and asking now would seem excessive, belated, revealing of something you should have managed earlier. You stop seeking belonging in collective spaces because they seem too slow, too imprecise, incapable of corresponding to the specificity of what you live. Because the logic of the group requires negotiation, and negotiation seems like a waste of time when you can move forward alone more quickly. You stop identifying with others who face similar conditions because the individual narrative denies that the conditions are similar. Each case is unique. Each trajectory is the result of each person's specific choices, and recognizing shared patterns would seem to be offloading responsibility from yourself. And at the end of that process, which can last years, which may have begun so early that there is no memory of it having been any different, isolation no longer seems like an external condition. It seems like a preference, a way of being. It seems like you. That is the mechanism. The gradual transformation of a structural condition into personal identity. The point at which the architecture becomes invisible because you have already internalized it completely. The question that organizes this video is not how to overcome isolation. That is the question the system wants you to ask, because it keeps the solution at the individual level, where the problem was also located. The question that matters comes before it. Where did the belief come from that standing alone against the world is a position of strength? Who benefits from a world composed of individuals convinced that dependence is weakness and belonging is surrender? What becomes impossible when the bonds are dissolved and each subject silently manages the weight of conditions that have a collective origin? These questions have answers. And the answers reveal that the radical individualism you internalized is not a philosophy of freedom. It is an architecture of containment, sophisticated enough to appear as choice, efficient enough to function without needing to show itself. That is the mechanism we are going to open now. To understand how radical individualism operates as a mechanism of containment, it is first necessary to observe what it produces in practice, not as an abstract idea, but as a concrete configuration of collective behavior. Every social structure has an interest in how individuals relate to one another. That interest is not necessarily conspired. There is no group convened consciously deciding how to fragment the population. It is more precise to say that certain configurations of relationship are functional for certain structures, and that these configurations tend to be reinforced by mechanisms that appear neutral, natural, simply the way things work. The most functional configuration for a structure that does not want to be questioned is that of atomized subjects. Subjects who perceive themselves as individual units, whose life conditions are the exclusive result of their choices and capabilities, and who therefore do not develop collective language to name what they share. Because collective language is the prerequisite of shared diagnosis, and shared diagnosis is the prerequisite of collective action. And collective action is the only scale at which certain forces can be confronted. A subject convinced that they are alone against the world does not organize, does not perceive that others face equivalent conditions, does not develop the vocabulary that would make visible what is structural rather than personal. They manage, in silence, individually, and when they cannot, when the weight exceeds the individual capacity for absorption, they interpret the collapse as personal failure and intensify the solitary effort. Isolation is not the side effect of an individualist culture. It is the most efficient product it could generate. There is a scene that repeats itself with infinite variations, and that is rarely examined with the attention it deserves. Two people facing similar conditions, equivalent economic pressure, equivalent professional instability, equivalent accumulated exhaustion, encounter each other, and each one reads the other's situation through the same framing they use for their own. The reading is individual. This person made such and such decisions, and that is why they are where they are. My situation is different, also the result of my choices, also exclusively my responsibility. What does not happen? The two people realize they are facing variations of the same structural pattern, that this pattern has causes that neither of them created, and that the shared experience could be the starting point for an understanding that transcends each person's individual case. This does not happen not because people are incapable, it happens because the available framing actively prevents that perception. The vocabulary of radical individualism has no category for a shared structural pattern. It has only individual cases with individual causes and individual solutions. And when the vocabulary does not exist, the perception that would depend on it also does not form. You do not see what you have no name to see. The two people part without a shared diagnosis. Each one returns to the solitary effort of managing conditions that would benefit enormously from being named together. The system keeps functioning without needing to do anything. The fragmentation perpetuates itself through the very framing it produced. The narrative of individual strength did not begin as a philosophy of freedom. It began as a functional framing for a system that needed subjects responsible for themselves, because subjects responsible exclusively for themselves do not develop collective demands. The strength the culture celebrates, the capacity to endure alone, to advance without support, to depend on no one, is precisely the configuration of the subject most convenient for a structure that does not want to be questioned at scale. You are not being celebrated for being strong. You are being celebrated for being contained, for processing internally what, if processed collectively, would become a diagnosis of something larger than you. The dissolution of bonds does not need brute force, it only needs shame. When seeking belonging becomes associated with insufficiency, when asking for support becomes evidence that you are not capable enough to not need it, the subject themselves begins to manage isolation as a matter of dignity. You do not isolate yourself because you were forbidden to connect. You isolate yourself because connection came to carry an image cost that the system made unbearable. Shame is the most efficient mechanism of containment ever produced because it does not need an external agent to operate. The subject manages it internally, in silence, and calls it pride. There is a category of exhaustion that has no available diagnosis within the individualist vocabulary. The exhaustion of carrying alone contradictions that have a structural origin. When the problem is framed as individual, the solution sought is also individual. More effort, more efficiency, more resilience. But there are problems whose scale is collective and that, when treated as individual, never reach resolution, only chronic management. The weight you feel and cannot name with precision frequently belongs to that category. It is not your weakness that the weight exists. It is that the vocabulary available for describing it was built in a way that renders its real origin invisible. Being alone is not merely an emotional or existential state. It is a political condition with precise political consequences. An isolated subject does not have the scale to confront forces that operate at a collective scale, does not have shared language to name what they feel in terms that transcend the individual case, does not have the experience of mutual recognition that is the prerequisite of any form of joint action. Contemporary isolation is not the result of people who chose not to connect. It is the product of a structure that made connection embarrassing, belonging suspect, and interdependence incompatible with the narrative of strength the system needs you to maintain about yourself. There is a consequence of radical individualism that is rarely examined with the clarity it deserves, and that is perhaps the most serious of all. When the subject internalizes that their condition is the exclusive result of their will and capacity, they not only stop seeking collective diagnosis for what they feel, they begin to interpret failure, when it comes, within the same logic. The failure is theirs. The insufficiency is theirs. The inability to sustain the weight is theirs. And that localization of failure in the individual is not only emotionally costly, though it is also epistemically distorted. Because the failure of an individual within a structure that produces specific conditions of pressure is not necessarily information about the individual. It may be information about the structure, but the available vocabulary does not offer that second reading. It offers only the first. And when the only available reading is the individual one, the subject who fails intensifies the individual effort, works more, endures more, demands more of themselves, treats insufficiency as a calibration problem, needs more strength, more discipline, more capacity for absorption. What they rarely do is question whether the problem lies in the individual calibration or in the scale of what is being demanded of an individual who should be operating with structural support that was withdrawn or that was never offered. That question does not appear, because asking it requires a collective vocabulary that isolation has made inaccessible. And here is the cycle that perpetuates itself. Radical individualism produces isolation. Isolation removes the collective vocabulary. The absence of collective vocabulary renders the structural origin of the problem invisible. The invisibility of the structural origin intensifies the individual localization of failure, and the individual localization of failure deepens the solitary effort, which deepens the isolation. The system does not need to do anything to perpetuate itself. The atomized subject self-regulates toward the configuration the system needs them to maintain. Here is the mechanism with the precision it deserves. Radical individualism is not a philosophy of freedom. It never was. It is an architecture of containment that operates through internalization, that works not despite appearing as choice, but precisely because it appears as choice. A subject convinced that their strength lies in depending on no one does not question the collective origins of their condition, does not develop shared language with others who face equivalent conditions, does not perceive that isolation itself, the sensation of being alone against the world, is a produced condition, not a truth about the nature of human existence. The structure that atomizes subjects does not need walls, does not need explicit prohibitions, does not need surveillance. It only needs each subject to genuinely believe that their situation is theirs, that the weight they carry is the result of their choices, that solitude is a configuration of strength, that seeking belonging is surrender. When that belief is installed, when the subject has completely internalized the framing the system needed them to internalize. The system can operate without showing its face. The subject isolates themselves. The subject interprets the collapse as personal failure. The subject intensifies the solitary effort and calls it maturity. The danger is not being alone. The danger is believing that this is inevitable, natural, and even desirable. Because as long as that belief remains intact, the collective diagnosis that would make the mechanism visible can never form. The diagnosis has been laid out with the clarity it deserves. Contemporary isolation is not an existential choice. It is not the result of people who preferred, for philosophical or temperamental reasons, to operate as independent units. It is the product of a structure that learned to perpetuate itself not through coercion, but through framing. That did not prohibit the bonds. It made them embarrassing. That did not order isolation. It made it indistinguishable from strength. The belief that facing the world alone is a virtue did not emerge from nowhere. It was built and reinforced by concrete mechanisms, by the way success is narrated, by the way the need for support is treated, by the gradual and systematic association between interdependence and insufficiency. And when that belief is installed, it produces precise and predictable consequences. The subject stops investigating the collective origins of what they feel, stops developing shared language with others who face equivalent conditions, stops perceiving that isolation itself is a political condition, with political consequences, and not a truth about the nature of existence. You are not alone because that is how life is. You are alone because a specific system benefits from your solitude and took care to convince you that it is your preference. Now look at what this implies in relation to the weight you carry. A part of what you manage in silence, the contradictions that do not resolve, the exhaustion that has no precise name, the persistent sensation of inadequacy in the face of demands that always seem slightly above your capacity. A part of that does not originate in you. It originates in structural conditions that were offloaded onto the individual with the narrative that they are the sole one responsible for managing them. This is not an argument for individual responsibility to disappear. It is the argument for it to be correctly located, not as the unique and exclusive category of explanation for everything you experience, but as one factor among others, some of which have a collective scale and cannot be resolved by individual effort, however great it may be. The distinction matters, because as long as everything is framed as individual, exhaustion is treated as a calibration issue, needs more strength, more discipline, more capacity for absorption. But when the structural origin becomes visible, exhaustion receives a different framing. It is the predictable response of an individual trying, with individual resources, to absorb the weight of conditions that demand a collective response. You are not weak. You are undersized for the problem, not because you are insufficient, but because the problem was deliberately presented at an individual scale so that the collective scale would never need to be confronted. And the first movement toward any other possibility begins precisely here, in the recognition that isolation is not inevitable, it is constructed. And what was constructed can at least be seen. Radical individualism is not a philosophical achievement. It is a political consequence of a structure that benefits from fragmentation. When there is no belonging, there is no collective language to name what is felt. When there is no collective language, there is no shared diagnosis. When there is no shared diagnosis, each subject alone carries the weight of contradictions that only make sense when seen together. And the system continues, not because no one perceives it, but because perceiving it within the vocabulary the system provided produces the same conclusions as always. It is your problem, solve it alone, push harder, endure more, be more. The fracture begins when the vocabulary changes. When my failure becomes a structural condition that produced this result. When my solitude becomes isolation produced by a system that benefits from it. When I need to be stronger becomes the problem has a scale that exceeds the individual. That change in vocabulary does not resolve anything immediately. There is no prescribed outcome. There is no sequence of actions that automatically follows from the diagnosis. But something changes when the mechanism becomes visible, the location of the question, and the location of the question determines the type of response that can even be formulated. At some point, in the face of the weight you carry, can you still distinguish what is genuinely yours from what was offloaded onto you by a structure that needed someone to carry it? That distinction is not comfortable, but it is the only one that can make the weight legible for what it truly is. The narrative that you are alone against the world is not neutral. It serves something, and what it serves is precisely the continuity of an order that learned to perpetuate itself without needing to show its face. By making each subject believe that isolation is their choice, their strength, their identity. Seeing that mechanism does not undo the isolation, but it makes it impossible to keep confusing it with freedom. The Antidote Philosophy channel exists to name these mechanisms, to ensure that structural analysis remains available in an environment that would prefer you to keep individually managing what has a collective origin. If that kind of thinking is what you want close, the channel is here. Subscribe. The code never stops running. The difference is knowing that it exists.